welcome to this podcast from Geopolitical Futures. I'm Christian Smith. In the past fortnight, Russian military aircraft entered the airspace of Estonia, Romania and Poland, all NATO countries. The provocations, for that is what they're being called by NATO leaders, come after negotiations on an end to the war in Ukraine have slowed, and after the US had just offered Poland more military assistance should it want it. 36 years on from the fall of the Berlin Wall, Poland itself has become one of the most significant NATO members and may soon become a member of the G20, the group of the world's largest economies. Poland's emergence as a major regional power was forecast by Geopolitical Futures chairman and founder George Friedman in his best-selling book, The Next 100 Years. So today we are joined by George to discuss what Russia's incursions into Poland, Estonia and Romania mean, and the role that Poland may play in the future of Europe. But first, just a quick reminder that you can find all of the analysis from George and his team of analysts by going, of course, to geopoliticalfutures.com. George, welcome. Look, let's start. Do you agree that these were deliberate provocations into NATO airspace? And has Putin done anything like this before?
Well, any one of them could have been a navigation error or something like that. Three of them, in roughly the same period of time, was obviously intended. What was it intended to do? Well, the Russians have a major problem. After 3 years of the war, they've only occupied 20% of Ukraine. This is a failure. This means that it's going to be very difficult for them to negotiate an end to the war, because after that, Putin would have to answer to the Russian public, and he does have to do that, why he spent so many lives and so much money and failed in this war. So the Russians can't reach a settlement on these terms. They just can't do it. At the same time, they can't take on NATO. If they couldn't take Ukraine, they can't take NATO. So they have to make gestures, threatening gestures, to try to split Europe. Okay? So in frightening the Poles then turn to NATO to do something. The French may not want to do it. The Germans may want to do it. But the point is, at this point in history, trying to break NATO apart to show them to be a failing entity is one strategy by the Russians. But we must always keep in mind that Putin cannot apparently end the war because he'd have to be answerable for his failure to wage a war for over 3 years and not achieve his goals. And so when they flow over this as a signal to various people that this might be spreading the war. Now, having failed completely in Ukraine, they're not in a position to spread the war. On the other hand, if they can convince NATO that they would, perhaps they'd be more frightened, more divided, and so on.
I suppose. So you're sort of suggesting that the justification, the reason for doing this is to divide NATO, is to show weaknesses in NATO. Do you really think he thinks that will work, or does he perhaps not know? As some people are saying, is he trying to see what actually might they do?
He doesn't have many cards to play. Putin must project an image of tremendous military power, when in fact, the facts are such that this military power is quite limited. By carrying out these intrusions, one, they're pretty meaningless. It's no big deal. Secondly, it indicates that he is willing to extend the war dramatically. Okay? And thirdly, he hopes that NATO is not united, that the article that says a war attack on one is an attack on everyone could crumble. But frankly, he has very few good options. I mean, he is in a very difficult position, as Lyndon Johnson was when the Vietnam War didn't go well, and he couldn't end it because then he'd have to admit that he failed. So this is a situation that in the world is not abnormal or unusual. So, in fact, I see this as a way to signal that he's more powerful than he is. Or, under these circumstances, one of the best solutions is to convince the other side you're crazy. You know, I don't mean that as a joke, really, that you are so pressed against the wall that you would commit acts that would be irrational. So the idea that he will go to war with Poland is impossible unless he takes Ukraine. I can't get there from here. But if he indicates that he's being so pressed so far against the wall that he might do something radical, then he has radical options. He's already spoken of tactical nuclear weapons and stuff like that on occasion. Then perhaps he can frighten them, divide them, and so on. And so I read it that way, not as a navigation error, but a way to show that he is powerful, potentially reckless, without ever actually taking a significant action.
I mean, there was a really interesting article written, I think, by one of Geopolitical Futures analysts last week or the week before about this in particular, where they were sort of drawing comparisons with the Cold War, where often, talks matter less or public statements matter less than action, and this is, of course, is happening in light of Ukraine negotiations or the lack thereof now in some ways. I mean, do you think that's quite similar, that just like the Cold War, where a bomber group flying close to the Russian or US airspace was more of a signal than actual talks?
Well, I think that's part of it. Talk is cheap, and what you say really doesn't matter. But in fact, the intrusion into your airspace as an act of showing his intent is really weak. I mean, they didn't penetrate deep. They didn't engage enemy fighters. They didn't bomb anything. They just kind of wandered into the edge of the other countries. So when you take a look at this, if this was meant as a signal of Russian aggressiveness, okay, it was a pretty weak signal. But certainly the Russians would want the West in general to feel that if they are mistreated by them, they're capable of engaging in what I'll call irrational actions, going to war with NATO. In fact, the Russians have been very cautious not to go to war with NATO. They've been very limited in their military power in terms of the war. So the last thing you want to do before you negotiate these things is to look weak. From my point of view, this is the weakest thing he could do, flying into airspace and then going home. But he doesn't have many options. So I see this as an attempt to show that Russia is not forced to end the war, that is prepared to expand the war instead, and give him a better negotiating stance. But I think the truth of the matter is that, given the geography of things, you really can't imagine a Russian assault on Poland, for example. You can't reach them. So, looking at it this way, I regard this as a form of negotiation. In negotiation, the most important thing you can do is stand up and say, well, I'm leaving these negotiations. I'm going to go do it. And that happens in every negotiation. But the objective fact is that Russia, after 3.5 years in a war controls only 20% of Ukraine. If they can't take Ukraine, they're not going to take on NATO.
So what does it mean for those negotiations then? I mean, some commentators have suggested that it won't be or hasn't been taken well by Trump, for example, or by the Europeans who would have taken it badly anyway, but who might look at it and say this shows a lack of willingness to compromise or to settle the war. Do you think that's fair? Do you think it's going to have any impact on the negotiations?
Well, I mean, it's very clear that Putin cannot end a war on this basis and survive politically in Russia. He led Russia into a war. He failed to win it and did very poorly. And to negotiate an end to the war under these circumstances really makes him look incompetent. This should not have been a war that was started in the first place. So when you look at it from the Russian point of view, well, this is about as good as they've thrown everything into the game that they have, and this is all they've gotten. When you look at it from Putin's point of view, aside from the Russian national point of view, okay, it's over, we move on. From Putin's point of view, there's no moving on from this point. So I see it, and I've consistently said this, and it is the fact that Putin could not deliver Ukraine on a platter after 3.5 years shows that he miscalculated from the beginning. And so I think this has more to do with internal politics in Russia, which are very hard to fathom and how they work because it's not clear. But it has to do with doing the least he could do, the less dangerous thing he could do, to show that he could be very aggressive. In fact, I think it was underwhelming in all ways. Minor intrusions in the airspace was not a dangerous thing. Overflights by mass bombers, that might have been interesting, but it's not this.
Let's have a look at from the European point of view then. I mean, a few weeks ago on this podcast, we talked about India and Trump's targeting of India with sanctions, ostensibly for its purchase of Russian oil and as a way of getting it to stop doing that. The EU last week decided that it was going to up its sanctions on Russian energy. I mean, there's still a timeline for that. Europe continues to be reliant on Russian gas in particular, as well as oil. I mean, why is the EU not moving faster to cut this off, given the consequences it would then have for Russia?
Well, the EU is not a military force, and there's no such thing as a European country. It is simply a group of independent countries with very different views on many things, joined together. But when we talk about Europe as a single entity, well, the position of Poland is very different than the position of France, and the British have a different view of everything as well. So it's important not to think of it as Europe. Poland has become a significant country, and it has a very different view of this war than the French or the British have. Okay? So rather than talking about what Europe thinks, we have to talk about what different European countries think about this. For the countries to the West, that doesn't mean all that much. Okay? For Poland, it's a fundamental reality that it has to deal with. So rather than talking about Europe as if it was a single entity, we have to parse it between the various countries.
Well, let's have a look at Poland now, I think, because that's really what we want to talk about in particular on this podcast. George, you're sort of going through the process of revisiting a number of the forecasts you made in your book, The Next 100 Years, which was released about 15, 16, 17 years ago now in the late noughties. I mean, talk us through your forecast on Poland from then. I mean, Poland's come a long way since 1989.
Well, I argued that Poland, as well as Turkey and Japan, would emerge as major powers. The idea at that time of Poland becoming a major power was laughed out of court hilariously. That was not possible. But what I saw in Poland was the single country that was facing the Russians, that placed them in a position that none of the other European countries were placed in, except possibly Romania, that placed them in a position where they could not stay the way they were. Many of the European countries are very conservative in their evolutions and so on and so forth. They can remain where they were and manage quite well. The Poles saw themselves as in a desperately poor position. And therefore, I thought at the time that they would have to emerge as a major power. Now we see Poland as about to become a member of the G20, the 20 largest economies in the world, and also having the third largest military force in NATO, after only the United States and Turkey. So Poland has emerged as a major military power because it had to. And it could not become a major military power if it didn't have a significant economy. So nations do what they desperately have to do. And this is why I say we can't talk about Europe, because the Polish position and the French position are very different. The French have very little at stake. The Poles have everything at stake. And on that basis, you can kind of predict what they're going to at least try to do. And my read on Poland was they'd manage to do it.
Enjoying the show? Take a moment to follow and rate us on your preferred podcast platform. For video versions of the show and much, much more, subscribe on YouTube. And as always, you can find expert geopolitical analysis at geopoliticalfutures.com. I want to ask about Poland's geography because that, as you know, the word geopolitics suggests, has a significant amount to do with things. I mean, obviously, people would look at the map and say, "Well, Poland is next to Belarus and the Baltic countries, and has historically been next to Russia." But I mean, it's not just that simple in terms of where it is on the map. There's more to the geography that matters there.
Well, where you are on the map actually has some significance. So the probability of a Russian invasion of NATO was always minimal. The Russian army, we tended to overestimate its capabilities. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian army kind of weakened itself. So the Poles could not assume that the Russians were weak. They did not have that luxury. If they had taken Ukraine, they would have been on the border of Poland. And therefore, for the Poles, the Ukrainian war meant something very different than for the rest of Europe. That geography is important because when that war began, if it had ended as if everybody expected with a Russian victory in months, taking this minor country, Ukraine, much weaker than it is, then the Poles would be in an existentially dangerous position, as with the Baltics and so on. So when we look at that, we have to really take a look at a very different psychology all through Europe. And the Poles' position, where it was significant. A victory in Ukraine, first of all, would have put the Russians right on the border of Poland and might have led them to believe that they might be capable of going further west. And so the Poles behaved very differently. And the rest of the Europeans definitely had very strong statements they made, very powerful statements. But their ability to rev up their economies, make a major military force, and so on, those weren't there and weren't needed. So geography matters.
And I mean, the North European plain as well in particular. I mean, Poland has been somewhere where the biggest wars in the past 200 years have been fought. I mean, it's not just Russia that has that memory, it's Poland as well.
Well, we have to remember, in World War II, it began with an invasion simultaneously by the Germans and the Russians of Poland. Remember that Hitler had made a pact with Stalin, a non-aggression pact, which agreed on two things. One, on the division of Poland. Two, a promise that they wouldn't attack each other. The Germans broke that promise. But on the other hand, you have to understand that between Germany and Poland and Russia, Poland was the pivot. Whoever controlled Poland was now in a position to threaten the other country. The solution was to divide Poland in half, and then their two armies were facing each other. So Poland was both a guarantor of peace between Russia and Western Europe, and a guarantor of peace in Russia from Germany. First, you had to get through it. When they divided it, they were right together, and therefore the wars could start. So Poland serves a very important purpose in Europe. not intentionally, just happens to be there. It is the buffer. Before the Germans can take the Russians, they must have Poland. Before the Russians can take or even dream of taking Western Europe, they have to have Poland. So Poland is a pivot between Russia and Western Europe.
It had the misfortune, just like Ukraine in many ways, of being where that pivot was, well, where those tensions were fought out. I mean, in many ways, that's part of its desire to grow economically and militarily in the past 30 years since it gained its independence from the Soviet Union. I mean, how has it managed to do that?
First, a great deal of discipline. When you're sitting on the firing line, you tend to put aside the transient problems and really focus in on the fundamental things. Secondly, their growth really returned them to the place they should have in Europe. In other words, under Soviet control, their ability to develop was limited, extreme. Once the Soviets left, it was what we call sometimes a dead cat bounce. If you throw a dead cat down hard enough, he'll bounce. And the Poles had been thrown way down, and they bounced. So in a sense, Ukraine had become the Poland of this era. It was the buffer between the two. The Russians wanted to take that buffer and end up on the Polish border. They failed. The Americans didn't want the Russians to be on the Polish border, but they also didn't want to get involved in a war. And the various European powers were all over the place until recently. So we have to understand that geography does matter in the sense that when you look at the map, the Cold War was a very different war because Soviet power was in the middle of Germany. They held East Germany and Poland and everything else. Now they're much further east, and that worries them because they were invaded by Napoleon Bonaparte. They were invaded by the Germans, and both them got nearly to Moscow and were destroyed by the Russian winter, not by the Russian army. The Soviets have a legitimate fear of Western Europe because they've been historically almost destroyed by them. On the other hand, Western Europe has a real fear of the Russians, that they want to move as far west as they can to have buffers. And so what you have here is a very logical progression of geopolitics. And when we personalize it, Putin is an evil man, Trump is a crazy man, Macron is a boring man, all these things that we might say. It's not about that. It is really about the imperatives nations have. And Poland had the imperative to become a significant military power. Without that economic growth, it could not become that. So it did the things that it had to do in order to survive. Because on the other side of it was Germany, in which they had no trust. So that it emerged as it did is logical, predictable.
I mean, looking at their military for a second, they now have the third largest military in NATO after the US and Turkey. They would obviously worry Russia if a conflict broke out in some way. But would they be a match for them now?
Well, on the attack, no. One thing that has been proven by a man as brilliant as Napoleon Bonaparte and by a man as ruthless as Adolf Hitler, you cannot conquer Russia. It is too vast. It has too much of a population that is willing to fight to defend itself. It's very cold in the winter. And these are all fundamental things that were learned. No one in his right mind, or that studies history at all, is going to invade Russia. Russia, on the other hand, did not invade Europe. It beat back the Germans and finally got in line. it was farther west than it could really support. Okay? So when you look at the logistics of it and the amount of troops that had to be there, it was a difficult thing. But the idea that Poland would be a threat to Russia, if Nazi Germany couldn't be a threat to Russia, if Napoleon Bonaparte couldn't be a threat to Russia, Poland's not going to be a threat. So the Russians, however, also look at it another way. Yes, Napoleon Bonaparte was not a threat to its survival. Yes, Hitler wasn't a threat to Russia, but it was devastating. Those wars were devastating to Russia and perhaps put them generations behind of what the economic growth could have been. So from the Russian point of view, finally defeating the enemy is at a very high price. So when they look at the West, they have a reasonable reason to say, I don't know what you're going to do. But if you do the worst case scenario, which frequently happens to us, you're a threat. On the other hand, if you're a threat, I want to go as far west as I can. So this is an old story. But remember always that, as I said, Hitler signed a mutual agreement not to attack each other, a mutual agreement to divide Poland among themselves, and then double-cross the Russians. The Russians do not trust easily. So they don't look at the Western Europe and say, you guys, will never do that. They have to do worst-case scenario.
Well, I mean, obviously in the past, 80 years, Poland has developed not the past 80 years, the past 30 years, 35 years, Poland has developed an important relationship with the US, both economically and militarily. I mean, what's the state of that now? There's been a few mixed messages out of Washington, particularly since Trump took over, but even more generally.
Well, Trump has been consistent in his support of Poland. Well, during his first presidency, he went to Poland, increased aid to Poland militarily, sent tanks and so on. The Poles wanted once they were serious to call it Fort Trump, I should say. They wanted to give it this name, and of course he refused. But Trump has a different relationship with Poland than he does with the rest of Europe. He understands fully that Trump is a strategic country. He has promised to send more troops. We already have 1,000 troops in there, I think even more than that. But he's promised to send more. He understands that Poland is the pivot. The Europeans also understand that Poland is the pivot, and they're quite happy to have the Americans arming them. The extent to which they're prepared to go to war in Ukraine is limited, and certainly not with Poland. So in this case, when you look at it, Americans have a deeper interest in Poland. Or put it this way, they're acting on it as if they had a deeper interest in it than the Europeans do.
I mean, we obviously saw a few weeks ago the US say it was going to draw down some of its funding of those countries on Russia's flank, militarily, that is. You don't see the same thing happening with Poland?
Well, what I'm saying is that Trump frequently says things. Trump is very much trying to get Putin to accept the reality that he's in, and is prepared to give him some concessions, frankly, to make it more politically possible for him to make a peace. So when you see Trump being more accommodating with Putin, he's trying to create a framework, and I'm not sure he can do it, in which Putin can make the peace and not appear to have won nothing. The problem is that he can't give them as much as they need, which is a much larger piece of Ukraine. And so when you look at Trump, it appears that he has an inconsistent policy. In fact, it's consistent. He wants to end the war in Ukraine. He does not want the Americans to be sending troops to Ukraine. He does not want the Russians to advance. What he realizes is that Putin can't afford personally to make that peace. And he's constantly making gestures toward him to make it appear, but it's insignificant gestures, really. It can't make it appear. To make it appear that he's not simply capitulating. What I think what Trump and the Americans generally understand is that Putin cannot capitulate. He cannot survive if he capitulates. And they're trying to give him a parachute to land. And Putin is trying to take advantage of this. But in fact, he doesn't have the capacity militarily to do that. He's still bogged down fighting in a very narrow sphere. But he has to demonstrate that he's still a massive power. Sending drones over Ukraine and then back into, over Poland, I should say, and back into Ukraine is not very significant. So all of these things that the Russians are doing are aimed at showing how strong they are. But when you look at them carefully, they're minimal actions.
I mean, looking back to Poland and its relationship, I suppose, with the rest of Europe now. I mean, specifically the major powers, Germany, France, the UK. I mean, it is extraordinary to look at Poland and how it's grown in the past few decades. I mean, it's predicted now that, well, on some predictions, that Poland might have a GDP per capita that's larger than the UK's by the end of the decade. I mean, do you think it is now seen in that same way by Germany, France, and the UK, that it is just as significant a player, or that it will be as them?
I think that Europeans take a long time to discover reality. This is very traditionalist, and Poland was simply a weak link in this region, okay? To be able to evolve and recognize that Poland has the largest military, one of the largest militaries in NATO, okay? To recognize them as one of the most dynamic economies in Europe is very difficult to do. We get used to certain things. It would, like seeing Mexico suddenly evolve as a great power. It would be very difficult for the Americans to make that transition. I don't know that the European governments have absorbed the fact of the shift in the center of power in Western Europe. I don't even think they think of Poland as part of Western Europe. They see it as a Slavic country. So I think geopolitics changes faster than the opinions of those around it. It takes a long while to take them seriously. But I think Europe at this point understands one thing. If Poland falls, well, Germany's next. So in that sense, they have a mixed view. One, Poland must be strong. But is it respected? Well, is it seen as a real powerful European country? Not yet. That will come in time.
Interesting. I mean, to finish off, I want to look at what role it could play in a potential peace in Ukraine. I mean, and that may be one of the turning points that changes attitudes. I mean, Poland rather, obviously geographically is pivotal. But I mean, what role do you think it could have? Could it play a role that would make the difference between the war going on and peace?
There's two ways a war's end. One is for the Russians to keep what they've had, agree to a peace based on those borders and so on. The second is a more radical thing, which is the idea of, and the Russians have mentioned this, that they never want to see NATO forces inside Ukraine. They don't want to see American forces inside of Ukraine. We don't want to see the Russian forces inside of Ukraine. The other thing is to turn Ukraine into a neutral country with no forces in there. In that case, if it was not divided in half, that'd be terrible, because then Western armies and Russian armies would be in the same position as they were during the Cold War, face to face, to fill the gap. If that was a neutralized country, then if either the Russians or the West decided to move in, there'd be ample warning. You don't mount an invasion without being noticed. And second, there'd be plenty of time for each side to enter and turn Ukraine into a battleground. Well, the Russians don't want to fight a battle with the West in Ukraine. The West does not want to fight a battle with Russia in Ukraine. So one end to this war could be a neutralized Ukraine under the governance of Kiev, not allowed to have a major military force of its own, but with the Poles sitting on one side and the Russians on the other side. If either one moves, both move. In this case, if this would be the settlement, and I don't know if there will be, but if this would be the settlement, then the Europeans desperately need a powerful Poland. And they will have to contribute to making it powerful. Then it becomes critical. I don't think this will happen, and yet I don't see any other solution. In other words, I don't see the Russians ending this war with what little they gained. I don't see the Ukrainians capitulating to them or needing to capitulate to them. And so if you want to end this war, you want to give Russia what it wanted initially, a buffer zone, and you want to keep Russia away from Poland. Creating a neutral zone with a minimal military force and no foreign power involved in it is one way it happens. It's a very reasonable solution, and hence it's probably unlikely because reasonable solutions are hard to find. But when you think about it, at that point, Poland really becomes central. And Poland will be able to demand much more of the Europeans. And at this point, this is really something that I think Putin put on the table when he said there can be no foreign forces in Ukraine. He didn't mention Russian forces. But on the other hand, that was clearly an option. It would be very hard, I think, for the Europeans to accept Ukraine as a buffer zone. But still, it might be one way to end it.
I mean, I suppose the question then would be the how would the government in Ukraine be run and that sort of thing? Would it be independent? I mean, it reminds me a lot of Belgium in the 19th century after Napoleon and how it was used as a sort of buffer state between France and Germany. I mean, I suppose in many ways that didn't work out very well. Is that a fair comparison, do you think? Or is that just one of many times in history that this has been done?
Well, I mean, it's a very logical solution. The Russians actually started the war because out of fear. They were afraid that Ukraine would join NATO, and the NATO armies would then be around 300 miles away from Moscow. And you say, well, they knew NATO would never invade. They also knew Hitler wouldn't invade. Their history is one of betrayal. And so they look at it this way. On the other side of the equation, the farther away the Russians are from Western Europe, the safer Western Europe is. So if you created a neutral buffer zone, which I think is a reasonable solution, but not one I necessarily expect to emerge, it would really stabilize the situation fundamentally, with the Ukrainians able to do everything but create a massive army. They'd be in charge of internal affairs. Would the Russians respect this? Well, would the Poles respect it? So it balances each other out. So it's one way the war can end. All wars end. The question is, how does it end from the internal politics of each country?
Mm-hmm.
This could work.
And if Ukraine would accept it, of course. I mean, quickly looking at away from Poland and the other countries bordering Ukraine in this scenario, I mean, Hungary in particular, which obviously, George, you know a lot about. I mean, how would they be involved in this, do you think? Would they be involved?
Well, they're not involved now. They're marginal. And the Ukrainians really don't have a choice. Because to the extent that they've been able to resist, it's been dependent on American intelligence, weapons from Europe, and so on and so forth. Okay? So Ukraine without that could not defend itself. So to be brutal, they don't have an option. On the other hand, this may be a way for Putin to claim, I won the war. we're not going to get NATO on our borders. As for the Europeans, it gives them a sense of security because they know that if Russia enters Ukraine, the Poles will go on either side. It's much better to have a wide buffer zone than a line drawn in a country, because then there's warning of attack, and that makes attacks much less likely.
And what about the Hungarians and say the Romanians as well?
Well, they're Hungarians and Romanians, and historically they were not relevant to the balance of power in Europe. So these are smaller countries. One of the realities of Europe is that they have very small countries. And even their biggest countries like Germany and France are very small compared to Asia, Western Hemisphere, and so on. And that makes wars really brutal because they've got to fight like the devil to hold on to what they have. So when we consider the size of the European countries and go back in history, the brutal wars they waged against each other in various ways, it was a question of size. Russia has a different problem. It has to pay a lot if it's invaded, but ultimately he can defeat the invader just by space and weather.
Well, George, thanks very much for coming on the podcast, as always. Now, if you want to read any of George's writings about Poland and its rise, as well as about Turkey and Japan, two countries George has also forecast on, you can go to geopoliticalfutures.com. But for now, thanks very much for listening. You take care, and goodbye.
Bye.
Talking Geopolitics is brought to you by Geopolitical Futures, your source for geopolitical forecasting and analysis.